let's talk about some other ways that rational choice theory can be used sort of in practice. So if you haven't seen my other video where I talk about things like geographic profiling and situational crime prevention and those types of things, go check out those other videos. But this is sort of more of a general way that we can use rational choice kind of tenets and ideas from the theory in a more specific way about reducing crime. So first, we can think about it from a general deterrence kind of perspective. And so general deterrence is essentially deterring the general public. So deterring people in general from wanting to commit crimes. And so that the perception then of punishment, or sort of seeing it applied in different situations, makes everybody kind of not want to risk all of these things happening to them should they decide to commit a crime. So offenders being punished makes it so others are afraid to commit crimes for fear of receiving that same punishment. So the biggest thing is that it is all about perception. And deterrence, whether we're talking about general or specific, which we'll get to next, but it's all about the perception. It's about what people think will happen if they commit the crime. The possibilities of punishment rather than the actual punishment that might happen. So if people think that they'll be punished and that punishment will be a bad thing, they just won't commit crimes. And so this is the reason why the majority of the population doesn't commit crimes, because we are all capable of some kind of crime, but we choose not to because of the perceived negative effects of crime, including those that would affect our personal morality or like hurt others or things like that. So it's not just about the actual like punishment. It's not like the fear of prison is the only thing stopping the entire populace from committing crimes, but it's that there are a lot of possible negative effects that could have to do with sort of our sense of morality as well. So these are sort of some examples of using general deterrence as a way to kind of prevent crime. So these are sort of, this is also using like a shaming technique. So all these people had to kind of stand out here with a sign. So this one says, she says, only an idiot would drive on the sidewalk to avoid a school bus. I'd agree with that statement. So, but that means that's what she did. And so she has to stand out here and basically tell the world what she did. This one says, I stole from a 9-year-old on her birthday. Don't steal her. This could happen to you. And I steal forks from restaurants. So this is just sort of using a very shame kind of focused, but also this is going to make it so people are like, oh, I guess I shouldn't steal forks from restaurants around here because this is what happens to people who do that. And so if they were thinking of doing that, they might not do it now. And that's the general deterrent effect. And it's that perception of what will happen if I do this thing. So looking at some of Cesar Beccaria's requirements for effective punishment, if we remember, and this was discussed in one of the previous videos, but the Cesar Beccaria talked about effective punishment needing to be, so we have to have a certain level of certainty of punishment. It also needs to be severe enough to be a deterrent, have a deterrent effect, and be swift. So that severity of punishment, certainty of punishment, and celerity or swiftness. So we want the certainty of punishment, where people think, and sort of from a general deterrent perspective, the probability of arrest and the probability of that punishment, we want that probability to be high, or at least that's the perception. We want people to think that the probability is high regardless of what the probability actually is. So that would make it so if people think the probability of being arrested and punished for doing various different types of crimes, that's going to convince people that these things are too risky and I'm not going to take that risk. Whereas the severity of punishment is we have to make it so that the risks of crime outweigh any potential benefits. So in that cost-benefit analysis in rational choice theory, we want to make it so the risks of crime and the negative effects of crime and the punishments that happen are they just outweigh any possible benefits they could get from committing a crime. But then also the punishment has to fit the crime, where you have worse crimes getting worse punishments. This is something else that Beccaria talked about, because otherwise we would have the marginal deterrent effect where people are just committing a whole bunch of crimes because if the punishment's the same, then they're going to commit the worst crimes. And that's kind of the idea. But then there's also the celerity of punishment, or sort of the swiftness, the speed of punishment. The punishment has to be swift, or it will not be tied to the crime in the minds of the citizens who witness it. So if people see a crime happen or hear about it on the news, and then it takes forever before any kind of justice is done, then that gap of time is going to make it so that the crime is not connected to the punishment, and so that it won't have that same general deterrent effect. But then there's also specific deterrence, which is where we want to basically prevent somebody who's committed a crime and has been sanctioned from wanting to commit that crime again, and to make it so that they're less likely to recidivate, which means reoffend. And so criminal sanctions then have to be powerful enough to reduce that likelihood of recidivism. Punishment essentially has to be a bad experience. If it's a bad experience, it's going to make it so that person doesn't want to have that experience again. So convicted criminals then should see punishment as something that they don't want to repeat because it sucks. So I don't want to have to go through this again. So maybe I should find some other way of making money or getting whatever thing it was that they wanted to get from crime. And that punishment could be prison, but it could also be things like fines. It could be, having to be on a registry of some kind. It could be, although the sex offender registry is not supposed to be a punishment, but it absolutely serves as that. But it's another topic though. Whatever the sanction is, it needs to be something bad enough that makes it so that person doesn't want to commit crime again because they've seen the costs of it and it's just not worth it. Incapacitation essentially just means if somebody is physically incapacitated, so they are in prison, they can't commit crimes. So incapacitation, advocates of incapacitation basically show the growth in the prison population can be seen as directly responsible for the decline in the crime rate, because we've seen a decline since the early 90s. In general, most crime has been kind of on the decline. And so advocates of incapacitation say, well, it's because we're putting more people in prison for longer amounts of time, so there's less crime. And because essentially people can't commit crimes when they're in prison. Makes sense. The sentence is also often during the most crime-prone years. So if you take somebody who's at the height of their criminal career in their late teens, early 20s kind of, and then you put them in prison for a certain amount of time, by the time they get out, they're already on the decline. If we remember the age crime curve, then they're already less likely to commit crimes just based on their age and just based on the years that are most likely where somebody's going to be committing crimes. So if somebody has a sentence then during those crime-prone years, we're basically incapacitating them and then being like, okay, now that your risk is lower, go out and don't recidivate. So that's kind of another argument from the advocate side. Opponents, however, of incapacitation basically say incapacitation doesn't deter future crime. And in fact, research has shown that prison makes criminals worse, especially young offenders and first-time offenders. So if you have a situation where somebody does, they commit a crime and they get caught for it, maybe that would have been enough to turn their life around, but now they're being sent to prison and interacting with a whole bunch of other criminals where everybody talks about how they got away with things, and you learn the justifications for crime. So not just the techniques, but the justifications and the moral justifications. So the longer you're in prison, the more that's going to have an effect on your view of the world. Maybe you also now have this idea that justice is unfair and the justice system is unfair. And so if those kinds of things are instilled while somebody is in prison, it's going to make them more likely to reoffend when they get out. And so this has a particularly large effect on young first-time offenders. So they are much more susceptible to these kind of influences. And it's also the case that if you put one person in prison, if you put one criminal in prison, another person is simply going to take their place. Especially if you think about something like drug trafficking. If you put a drug trafficker in prison, that will be a gap that will be filled pretty quickly. Because there's a high demand for drug trafficking, and it's not something that's going to go away if you just sort of pick out some of the traffickers. It's going to be filled by somebody else. So it's not actually reducing crime, it's just reducing crime from that individual. And then there's the idea that we look at this sentencing happening during crime-prone years, and that is true. But then what's also kind of true is that people in prison are already aging out anyways. Because typically we don't sentence youth or first-time offenders to lengthy sentences. So it's actually usually when they're a little bit older that they're actually getting the longer sentences, especially when you look at something like 3 strikes laws. which would be an example of advocates of incapacitation, would like something like 3 strikes laws, where you have 3 separate felony convictions leading to a mandatory minimum of up to a life sentence. But if the youth population are the ones most likely to commit crimes, but they're also unlikely to get put away for long periods, we're not actually sentencing during these crime-prone years, at least not those lengthy sentences. Those lengthy sentences end up coming a little later on when somebody is probably close to potentially aging out anyways. They don't need that long sentence anymore. They just need, just be like, no, we're not taking this anymore, put them in prison for a certain amount of time. But, the decades in prison is not going to do anything for somebody who's already aging out anyways. So people who are currently sitting in prison, a lot of them are probably aging out or have already aged out, and their risk would be very, very low. But then we're just keeping them in prison just because. So the idea of incapacitation, there's you can see both sides to it, and it depends on the type of crime and the type of criminal we're talking about. It depends on what we mean by a lengthy sentence. So a couple of years might be considered a lengthy sentence if we want to just incapacitate somebody for a certain amount of time, but decades might be a lengthy sentence for somebody else. So some of the specifics, it depends on what we're talking about, but there are certainly arguments for both sides. And then there's something that's called the just desserts model. And so this is desserts as in deserving, not like desserts, like with an extra S, that means like what you're eating, pie. But the just desserts model basically says people deserve what they get. So it is a very retributive model. And it's this idea that if you do something bad, you should have something bad happen to you. And it's your just desserts. So punishment is necessary to restore order from this model. So in order to bring people back and bring people back to equilibrium, we have to right the wrong via punishment, essentially. And offenders are to blame for their crimes, and so they deserve punishment. However, from this model, the accused rights are important because it would be unfair to have more punishment than it's necessary, because all we want to do is reestablish that equilibrium. We don't want to over-punish either, because that's also not fair. You should deserve what you get, or you deserve the punishment that you get, but no more. So that's also an important part of this model, is that yes, people deserve punishment if they've done something wrong, but they don't deserve more than based on what they've, the harm that they've caused. And so from this model, punishment based purely on either deterrence or incapacitation is wrong, because that means that we're basing it on future actions that we're trying to predict. So if we're like, oh, well, we want to put this person in prison so they don't commit a crime again in the future. We want it to be that, that bad thing that they don't want to do again. Just basing on deterrence is wrong from the just desserts model, because the just desserts model is, well, we just want to punish you for what you've done. Same thing if we want to incapacitate you. If you're like, oh, you are super crime prone, your risk is really high right now, we just need to keep you in prison for this time. That's also wrong from this model, because you're assuming that they're going to commit more crimes when you don't know whether or not that's true. So the just desserts model is not about any kind of future actions that can't be predicted. It's just about, you did this, you deserve this. And that's the entire basis of this model.